her nephew. So that was what Christopher seemed to be to this stranger. It gave Catherine a big shock. Her heart felt like it stopped. And his surprise, his embarrassing surprise, when she said Christopher was her husband, and her own discomfort when she told him. Was the difference between them so big? It wasn't in London. In London, before they married, they often stood together in front of a mirror and laughed to see how no one would guess, really no one could guess, that they were not the same age. Besides, what about all those bus drivers and people calling her Miss? One of them even called her Missy. "Take care, now, Missy," he said, holding her arm. "Don't jump off before we stop, or you might get hurt and get us into trouble with your young man." But she thought he had been drinking. It must be because she was always so tired now that she looked older. Today she was tired. Yesterday she had been tired. Oh, so tired, so tired. She looked up at Mr. Gerald, while the red color faded from her face, and thought how terrible it would be if every time she was tired, people thought she was Christopher's aunt. What a shame. And sooner or later he would notice it himself, and hear it too from strangers, just as she was hearing it from this stranger. "Let us sit down," said Mr. Gerald kindly, "and wait for them to come back." A day or two later, Christopher wanted to move around. He wanted to do something, anything, that wasn't lying in the grass reading poetry to Catherine. If he didn't read poetry to her, she was surprised and asked him why, because at the beginning he wanted to do nothing else. So he rented a small car and drove her around the island. They stopped for the night at a little place on the west side. There was a small hotel they liked. When they went in and asked if they could stay for the night, the young lady in the office, looking at them, said she was very sorry, but she had only one room left. "But we only want one," said Christopher, surprised. "We want a double room, that's all." "Oh, I'm sorry," said the young lady, turning red and looking down at her book to hide her confusion. "Yes," she said, running her finger down the page, "I can give you number 7. "Do you think she thought we weren't married?" said Christopher, amused, when they were in number 7 unpacking their bags. "Or do you think she thought we were so important that we needed a sitting room?" Catherine, busy with her bag, said nothing. She couldn't. She felt sick, as if someone had hit her head. Again she had been taken for Christopher's aunt. Or even for his no. Her mind didn't want to think that word. It simply refused to look at it. They saw no more of the Geralds, though Christopher had talked about long and fun hikes with the eager Billy while they ran ahead that morning before he realized that Catherine had been left behind out of sight. When he did discover this, he had turned back at once. "Come on," he said to the surprised Billy, holding her wrist, "we must run." And he had run, and she had run, thinking it was great fun, but wondering why they should be running. After that, when they all came together again, her father took her back to the hotel. The Monktons went for their picnic by themselves, and she never saw them again or heard anything more about the promised scrambles. But one thing she did hear, with surprise, from her father, and that was that Mr. Monckton was Mrs. Monckton's husband. "No," cried Billy, her eyes very round, adding, after a pause, "Good Lord." "Quite," said her father. A few days more and the honeymoon was over. Christopher did not try to leave Catherine again, because she didn't seem well, though she told him she was, told him eagerly, almost too eagerly, that it was only the spring. He couldn't quite believe this and stayed with her and took care of her. She loved to lie very quietly in his arms, outside or anywhere, while he read to her or they both slept. He stopped himself from being restless, because he knew if he said he wanted to walk, she would want to walk with him, and then she would be very tired and he wouldn't get his exercise. He thought it was strange how little they talked now. They used to talk a lot before they were married. Now they hardly said anything, except when they whispered, and then it wasn't really talking, but just feelings with a few words. Still, it had been a wonderful, wonderful time, something to remember happily all their lives. When we're old, he said, the last evening, we will think about this time. Just as if, she thought, holding him close so she wouldn't have to think about it. When he was old, she wouldn't, far ahead of him, be past thinking at all. He had to be back at his office at the end of the second week, and the last night in their happy place they hardly slept at all, because they didn't want to lose any minutes of what was left of their honeymoon. Because of this, in the morning, while Christopher was as happy as a lark, eating breakfast cheerfully and packing with energy, Catherine could hardly move because she was so tired, and was really shocked by her tired face when she saw it in the mirror. Luckily, he noticed nothing that time. He was too busy packing up, too happy in the fresh morning to be doing something different, to be starting a journey. Besides, wasn't he going to work hard now? Didn't he have something to work for? Responsibilities, the sweetest, most wonderful in the world? He was eager to start, to do well, make her proud of him, and earn money for her as that old George had earned money for her. With excitement, he swept his scattered things into his suitcase, whistling love songs from the immortal hour as he packed. With excitement, he settled the bills and gave tips to the staff. With excitement, he walked, his arm through Catherine's, down the path to the gate for the last time, and waved to the buttercup field where he would not have to lie again. He was in high spirits. It was fun getting back to work, beginning it again in these new happy conditions, with Catherine to send him off in the morning and welcome him back at night. Now he would have variety. Now he would have work and love, absence and presence, in the right amount. He was very happy. It seemed amazing to him, as he lovingly looked down at her when they were in the bright, warm sunshine on the ferry, that he had actually gotten Catherine. Life was wonderful, full of possibilities, a thing of great beauty. The waters of the Solent danced and sparkled. White wings flashed in the deep blue sky. The sun was hot on the back of his neck. The wind was fresh and salty in his face. The world looked like it did on its first day. Old Louis. He would go and find old Louis tomorrow and make him come and have lunch in one of those nice little restaurants where the food was good and there were no ladies, and talk his head off. And on Saturday, he would take Catherine down and introduce her to his uncle, who would certainly love her, and she would wander around the garden and enjoy herself while he played a round of golf with his uncle, who was really looking forward to it. So was he. His honeymoon had been wonderful, but 2 weeks was enough. It wouldn't be enough, and one would never want it to end, if one were going to be separated from one's beloved when it was over. But here they were, he and she, starting the joys, the very joys of married life with him, the man, getting ready in the morning and going to work until the evening, as men had always done, and coming back at night to his home and his wife. And this, after all, was better in the long run than a honeymoon, just as real good bread and butter was better than always having cake. "I'm so happy," he said, slipping his arm around her and giving her a quick hug when no one was looking. He couldn't see her face. She was sitting too close to him and had put on a gauze motor veil. "Darling Chris," she murmured, smiling through her veil. But she would have liked it better if he hadn't been quite so very happy on that particular morning. After all, it was the end of their honeymoon, and they would never have one again. Yet, maybe it was good it was finished. Once at home and he at work, she would be able to sleep at least all day. In London, Mrs. Mitchum, wanting to do the right thing, had filled George's different bits of china with white flowers, and the living room with its heavy black furniture looked more like a well-kept memorial than ever. She herself was very clean and tidy in her best apron, and her face was covered with welcoming smiles, though she was actually very nervous and embarrassed. She had always liked Christopher, with the kind liking of the older female servant for the lively young gentleman, and she knew that marriage was marriage, yet she couldn't help turning a little red when he walked into her mistress's bedroom as if it were his. So it was his, but for years and years it hadn't been his, and for years and years before that it not only hadn't been his, but had been poor Mr. Comfort's. It was her clear memory of poor Mr. Comfort, the times she had taken him and Mrs. Comfort their morning tea into that very room, and they were always so pleasant and happy together in their double bed. That gave her this feeling of shock when she saw Christopher walking in. Mrs. Mitchum, who was so well trained that even her thoughts were respectful, wouldn't have dreamed of comparing Christopher to a cuckoo. But she had heard about the bird's habits of using nests that weren't its own, and deep down in her subconscious mind, where no training had ever reached, was the idea that her mistress was naturally the prey of cuckoos for Stephen, pushing her out of her original home, and now Christopher taking over this one. She could only hope that everything would be okay. What was obviously not okay was her mistress. Mrs. Mitchum couldn't believe how much her mistress had changed in such a short time. "It's those honeymoons," she said to herself, shaking her head over her saucepans. "They weren't good for a woman, not after a certain age. You had to be very strong to handle them at any time. No rest. No regular hours. Never knowing where you were." Christopher looked fine. The young gentleman did. And it wasn't because of being unhappy that her mistress didn't look fine, because already, in the 15 minutes since they had arrived, Mrs. Mitchum had seen more love in the flat than she remembered during the whole time of poor Mr. Comfort. She couldn't help wondering what that poor gentleman would say if he could see what was happening in his flat. He wouldn't like it, she was afraid, but perhaps nobody who was dead would like what they saw if they could come back and look. Even Mitchum wouldn't. What Mitchum wouldn't like seeing, if there was nothing else to complain about, would be how well she had managed without him. She carried the asparagus into the dining room. Once again, as she opened the door, she felt uncomfortable. How should she have thought of knocking first? She had never had to knock at any door except bedroom doors since she had been working. Whenever she went into a room, everything would be just as nice and what you'd expect. Mr. Comfort at the head of the table, taking a sip of claret, Mrs. Comfort on his right hand, quietly eating her toast. "I've done a good day's work today," Mr. Comfort would be saying. "I'm so glad, George dear," Mrs. Comfort would be answering. Things like that would be happening in the room, things you'd expect. Or, in the living room, Mr. Comfort would be on one side of the fire, Mrs. Comfort on the other, reading parts of the evening paper to each other. "It seems to me this government doesn't know what it wants," Mr. Comfort would be saying. "It does seem so, doesn't it, George dear?" Mrs. Comfort would be answering, quiet and ladylike. But this, impossible for Mrs. Mitchum not to start and draw back when she opened the door. She all but scattered the lovely asparagus over the carpet. She wasn't used to, neither was her mistress. She couldn't have believed. Come in, Mrs. Mitchum," the young gentleman called out cheerfully, picking up his napkin that had fallen onto the floor. "We're married, you know. It's all right. You signed the certificate yourself." Mrs. Mitchum smiled nervously. The sauceboat rattled in its dish as she handed it to her mistress. She wasn't used to this sort of thing.